morning, everyone, and thanks again for inviting me to speak at this event. This talk is going to be more on topic than the talk yesterday, I suppose, because it's about GPL compliance, and GPL compliance is actually required in any system that includes GPL licensed software, such as the Linux kernel, obviously. I'm not going to cover basics about GPL compliance here. This is not a talk about how you comply with the license. I think Lucien from the OSS Foundry has given a talk about this subject yesterday. I want to step back a little bit from the legal bare minimum compliance to why do we have the GPL in the first place, and why do we want to have GPL compliance. Step a little bit back. And then after that first part, I'm going to cover current developments and current things that are happening in terms of, or in relation to GPL enforcement and GPL compliance. So if we go back a little bit in history, in the 1970s, software becomes copyrightable. Before that, there was no copyright, and therefore anyone could copy software. In the 1980s, we see the start of the GNU project. We see the first version of the GPL being written for projects as part of that GNU project. In the 1990s, we see the Linux kernel appear. We see the GPL license version 2 being written, and we see a lot of free software commercially being used on servers. In the after the 1990s, in the 2000s, and now especially 2010s that we are right now, Linux and free and open source software is everywhere, and I always like to use that picture to illustrate that. This is an in-flight entertainment system in an airplane on which I have been sitting, and at some point the system decided to reset, and I was seeing a Linux kernel booting in the seat in front of me. So actually, Panasonic is the manufacturer of this system. They are very strong in in-flight entertainment systems, and chances are very high, even if it's a much older system than that one. This is a really modern system. You see large screen and USB port and Ethernet port and stuff like that. But even in much older systems, they are Linux-based. Just on the flight here, I actually took a picture. I haven't put it up in this presentation, but I took another picture of such a system booting a much older one. So I wonder how GPL compliant those systems are, but well, that's perhaps something to consider another time. Now, what I want to say is that Linux is everywhere, and since Linux is everywhere, we see more license violations. It's only logical. If Linux is used in more markets and more products, then of course the probability of seeing license violations also increases. One of the problems is that many new companies who haven't been using Linux in products before suddenly start to use Linux, or other GPL licensed software. Of course, it applies the same way. And those, I would call them newbies, they really don't have a history in the free and open source software communities, specifically not in the Linux community. So they don't share the same culture, they don't share the same values, they don't share the same norms. It's like, somebody from a Western country coming to Taiwan the first time and having no idea about the culture and making all kinds of mistakes and maybe insulting people or something like that, being very impolite, very rude. And this is exactly what happens when companies enter the free and open source software world for the first time. And unfortunately, many companies take 10 years or more to learn how to behave. And that's, I think, that's causing a lot of tension. So they primarily use Linux and free and open source software to reduce the royalties instead of proprietary operating systems. And then, well, since they don't really care about anything else, they run into troubles in terms of GPL violations. Now, since we have more violations, I think the logical conclusion is that we will see, or we are seeing, and we will see even more license enforcement. I'll get back to that later in this presentation. I think what we have been observing is also an interesting development in terms of markets, or in terms of products. So the first GPL violations that were actively involved in enforcing were Wi-Fi routers in 2004, I think it was, around that time. So when the first Linux-based Wi-Fi routers, Wi-Fi access point plus router devices came out, we had that market. And I think initially in that market, nobody was GPL compliant, and after some time, after some enforcement, more companies started to consider becoming GPL compliant, release the source code and so on. But then we have new types of devices like network attached storage. And the companies doing network attached storage devices are not necessarily the same companies that have been doing the Wi-Fi routers. Or even if it's the same companies, it's different business units, different departments. They haven't heard about GPL compliance before, so they do the same mistake again. And we see this with all kinds of new products. We see it with Android phones, with Android tablets. We see that with set-top boxes. We see that with personal video recorders. So anytime a certain new type of device hits the market, and there are several vendors for it, there is sort of a peak in GPL violations when such a new type of device comes onto the market. Let me assure you that the community, or large parts of the community, are very upset about the violation of not so much the legal details of the license, but the violation of its norms. Right? The people who create Linux and other free and open source software, they do so because they believe in the superiority of a collaborative model. And if you want to benefit from it, then you have to participate in that collaborative model. The license is just a tool to try to achieve a minimum necessary involvement of companies who use GPL licensed software. And even not that absolute bare legal minimum is fulfilled by a lot of the companies in the various industries. So GPL compliance is the absolute necessary minimum of what companies have to do when they engage with GPL licensed software. It's not sort of the upper end, it's the lower bar of engaging with free software. So this is also perceived by a lot of people as something like a lack of respect of those respective companies towards the community. The enforcement of the license that you're seeing is sort of the only possible way for the community to educate companies how to engage better with free and open source software. So, just to assure you, nobody who is involved in license enforcement is doing that because they like to talk to lawyers all the day, they like to go to courts, they like to write hundreds of pages of paper all the time. These are people who want to write code. These are technical people. They want to generate good software. They don't want to work with this. But the behavior of companies forces us to do that kind of work. So, what kind of GPL enforcement have we been seeing? Before 2003, around that time, mostly, if at all, the Free Software Foundation has been doing enforcement quietly and out of court only. From 2003 on, a project that I started called GPL Violations.org has started. We have handled more than 200 cases by now. 200 cases does not mean we went to court 200 times. 200 cases means we have done GPL enforcement 200 times, and probably 190 or 185 out of these did never have to go to court because the companies were smart enough to become compliant after getting a notification and did not actually have to go to court. So from 2005 onwards, roughly about that time, the Software Freedom Law Center has been doing some enforcement in the States. That work has now mostly shifted into the Software Freedom Conservancy. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. And there's also some enforcement that is not publicly really visible because it happens in a different way. And that's, at least traditionally, I'm not sure what's happening now with Oracle owning MySQL, but at least in the past, MySQL used to do dual licensing on their libraries. The client libraries were GPL licensed, and if you use MySQL client libraries, at that time, if you use them under non-GPL licensed software, or non-GPL compatible licensed software, then you would have to obtain an alternative license from them. So they did a lot of GPL enforcement in terms of not to get source code, but they did it in order to sell their alternative license, which is legitimate, and it is GPL enforcement. but not many people are aware of it. The same goes for Asterisk today. The popular voice over IP switch is also a dual licensing model. They have alternative licenses that they offer, and some companies are buying these alternative licenses to create proprietary derivatives of it. Some other companies just use the GPL licensed version and run into problems and are subject to GPL enforcement. So let me state again, it's the communities are technical and not legal. Well, there is a legal community by now around free software, but you know, at large, the free and open source software community is a technical community, and yeah, that's basically what I said before. So cooperation, a culture of sharing. It's the license is not a means, an end in itself, but it is just a mechanism to ensure at least a certain level of minimum interaction between companies who use it and who probably create derivative works and so on. So the compliance is the minimum, and from there I would like to ask everyone to consider to establish what I would call a healthy relationship with the free and open source software communities. It's not just the license compliance, and it is particularly not a supplier and customer and supplier relationship. Like you go to an OS vendor and you buy something, and then you are entitled to a certain level of support, and you God knows whatever kind of things. The community expects you to participate in the development. If the companies that use Linux are not driving the development of Linux, who is? You know, who would be doing it? And if you look at who contributes to the Linux kernel, there are always these nice statistics every couple of months. LWN publishes them. It is large companies who pay people to contribute stuff to the Linux kernel. Right? There's Intel, there's IBM, there is all kinds of companies. Sometimes you even see Oracle, or you see names that you never heard of. I mean, there are lots of companies involved in that, in contributing, and you also see an increasing amount of, specifically if you talk about the embedded industry, you see an increasing amount of involvement from companies that produce system on a chips, like Texas Instruments. Like Samsung, who in the last couple of years have not been contributing any code to the Linux, well, previous years haven't been contributing any code to the Linux kernel. And in the last 2 years, they're putting all of their drivers and all of the code supporting their ARM system on a chips into the mainline Linux kernel. And you can see that with several other companies. So there's definitely a change. But if I look, for example, at, well, it's always sort of bad to name certain individual examples, but if you look at a popular ARM system on a chip made in Taiwan from a company with a 3-letter acronym, then you will see that not only do they not contribute their drivers back into the mainline kernel, but you will also see that the drivers are not even GPL licensed software and are thereby, for many people, actually a violation of the GPL. So it's definitely a situation that needs improvement. Now, why should embedded electronics companies participate more actively or SoC vendors participate more actively in the community and in the development? Well, there's a larger number of developers looking at the code and working on the code. So actually, the amount of review that the code gets and the quality the code can achieve is probably much higher than you can achieve in any reasonably sized organization internally. There will be more bug fixes because more people look at the code, and you will have more innovation because the amount of ideas and things people do with the code in a larger group of engineers is probably certainly bigger than in the small group of engineers that you have inside your company. Also, one of the things that companies involved in doing Linux kernel related development always have a hard time with is finding skilled developers. And if you want to attract really skilled Linux kernel developers, then you have to be an attractive place to work for them. You're not going to convince people like you know, the big names or anyone who has a long history in Linux kernel development. They're not going to come to work for your company unless your company is perceived as a company who actually can deal with free software in a reasonable way and respects the values and norms of the community. Otherwise, those people will simply refuse to ever work for you because it's, you know, they're not interested in that. Also, we have had situations on the Linux kernel mailing list. I'm not sure how many people realize that, but I think an HTC engineer was asking a technical question on the Linux kernel mailing list, and he was being told, well, go away, your company is GPL compliant, and when you're compliant, you can come back and ask your technical question again. Right? That's, I mean, it's a single example, but I think it illustrates very well the feeling that many people have about this kind of relationship. Also, in the long term, of course, getting your code mainline, getting your code upstream is reducing the maintenance cost that you have with the code. Because it is in mainline, you don't have to constantly port it to a later version. It is automatically always in the latest version. You don't have to, you know, every time there is you want to upgrade to a new kernel version, you have to do all this porting and all the API changes and everything that it went through. You don't have to do any of that anymore. Okay, well, how do companies do this? I guess most people in here know this, so I can go over the slide very quickly. Well, I think what I see a lot in companies all over Asia particularly is that developers who work on the Linux kernel inside companies are not even permitted to engage in technical discussions on mailing lists. So if they need to do that, then they probably have to get an use a wrong name and get a Gmail address and then not disclose that they might be working for a certain company or something like that. Submit the modifications to the respective upstream projects. Even if at some point your code does not get merged or you don't have the time to clean it up all the time, at least try to submit it, because then it's out there and some other people who may want to pick it up can pick it up. Or it gets into the staging tree, or God knows what kind of things might happen to it. But release it. Release early, release often. Join technical conferences. Discuss technical issues. Yeah, encourage the community to innovate and extend whatever you've been doing. There's a lot of things that can happen when this is done right. So, well, I'm going to skip a couple of slides here and get to current developments in GPL compliance. Well, one of the things that have been happening over the last 2 years or so, which I'm not sure how much everyone is aware yet, is that there are now more entities that are doing GPL enforcement. It's not just GPLviolations.org anymore. The Software Freedom Conservancy in the United States has been doing a lot of license enforcement. Also very actively in court as well as out of court. They have copyright on parts of BusyBox, and they use that copyright to enforce the GPL on a number of embedded devices. There has been quite a number of entities and companies that have been upset about that. I have the feeling more upset about the enforcement that GPLviolations.org has been doing, but on the other hand, we need to see more enforcement. The amount of GPL violations and the amount of reports that I get every week is unbelievable, and there's no way how we can ever keep up with enforcing all those GPL violations that we see. So we need to prioritize, and we need to pick and choose. And in the past, for example, some companies were under the perception, well, in the United States there's no GPL enforcement, so we can just ship whatever we want and we don't have to take care about that. But this is now changing, and definitely if you ship a product into the United States, there's now a much higher chance that, that some enforcement will happen by means of Software Freedom Conservancy. There are also sometimes misrepresentation about the activities of the Conservancy. Some claims that have been made are definitely not true. So I would encourage people not to be afraid of the Conservancy, but to relax a little bit and think about GPL compliance and not so much about fear of the Conservancy. I personally think it's good to see enforcement outside Europe, and it's very good to see first court cases in the US. And we need more precedent in favor of GPL enforcement to cause more deterrence and drive companies away from intentionally taking the risk of infringement. So from my point of view, there's much too little enforcement still, and there are way too many GPL violating products out there on the market. And well, now in the past, some people said, well, it's about BusyBox, so maybe we can, I mean, Android, the standard Android build doesn't use BusyBox anyway, so we don't have to care about the Conservancy. Well, the Conservancy is now in agreement with a couple of Linux kernel developers who have copyright on the code. One of them is sitting in the audience over here, Matthew, who has been presenting yesterday. And this means that the Conservancy is able to do GPL enforcement on the Linux kernel itself now, and that we will see Linux kernel-based GPL enforcement in the United States. So the idea that you don't have to worry about the Conservancy catching you if you violate in the US because you don't use BusyBox, that loophole is gone. Well, then let me talk a little bit about a case that we had in Germany, the second most recent court case, a series of court cases that I have been involved in. I want to explain it in a little bit more detail because it's a very uncommon case. Normally the GPL violation cases that we have is very clear. Some embedded product ships into the market, and the product does not contain the license text, it does not contain a written offer, and you have no way how to obtain the source code. So that's the typical violation, and then GPL violations are we do the usual procedure, sending them a warning notice or apply for a preliminary injunction and so on and so on. So that's the standard procedure. But this case is very, very different, because here the violation of the GPL was not that no source code was provided or no license text was provided. So it starts with a company called AVM in Germany, which is actually, nobody may know it here, but in Germany they have more than 60% market share in DSL customer premises equipment. They're not an OEM, they do all their design in-house, so all the hardware and software design is done in Germany, it's just the manufacturing they outsource. And their product is called Fritzbox. Extremely stupid name, but well, it's not the point here. They heavily use Linux, and like most other DSL routers, they heavily use Linux and other free and open source software on their product. As opposed to your standard Asian Linux-based DSL router, they have much more proprietary software in the product, actually. So for example, they don't even use IP tables for packet filtering and network address translation, but they have their own code which they link into the Linux kernel. So there's a lot of proprietary code that they wrote themselves and include in the product, but that's also not the point about GPL violation here. So this Fritzbox is distributed with the GPL license text, is distributed with a written offer, and they make a source code download available. So on first sight, they're GPL compliant. The product is GPL compliant. Now we have a second company in Germany called Cybits, which is a vendor of well, child-safe content filtering software. So as a parent, you can install that filter to prevent your children from accessing all kinds of websites that you would not want them to access on the internet. And normally, traditionally, their software was to be installed on the desktop PC. And then they thought, well, you know, if now people with smartphones at home and tablets and so on, why install all this filtering on every device? We can just put it on the DSL router, and then it works for the entire household, for all the devices in the home. So what they did is they developed a version of their filtering software that you can install, or that the user can install on his DSL router, on the Fritzbox. The installation procedure worked a little bit like this, that they download the original firmware update from AVM, from the server, then they unpackage that firmware, extract the file system image, make some modifications to some scripts, some startup scripts, and put some additional binaries inside, and then repackage the firmware, and then ask the user to install that firmware into the DSL router. So a pretty standard procedure that is used a lot in many community projects. If you look at how modified mobile phone software images work, in a lot of the cases traditionally this is done exactly the same way. People extract the file system, they change a little bit of code, package it together. Even with Windows Mobile 6 already this kind of stuff was done a lot. And package again. But the difference here is that it's a company doing this commercially. It's not just some random person online who's doing something for fun, but it's a company doing this in a commercial way. So the modified image is installed by the user. The way this is done is that the download of the firmware happens by the owner of the Fritzbox. The modification happens on a PC of the owner of that Fritzbox, and owner of the Fritzbox who has bought the device then installs it. So Sybits is never doing anything directly with any of the devices because they don't own it. It's always the user, the owner of the device that's doing this. Now what happened is that AVM, the producer of the Fritzbox, asks a court to grant a preliminary injunction banning Sybits from distributing software that modifies their firmware, so the AVM firmware, based on a number of claims, some of them copyright claims, some of them trademark claims, some of them unfair competition claims. And the court actually, in the first iteration, granted that injunction based on AVM's claims, and issued a preliminary injunction halting Sybits from distributing such software. The problem is that AVM claimed, well, this is our product, this is our firmware, we have the copyright on the firmware, and therefore nobody can do it, can do something like that. Well, then I heard about this case and joined, well, the second and third and fourth court case related to this entire issue as something called a side intervener under German law. So basically, I can join on the side of the defendant, even though I'm not the defendant, because my rights are affected by the entire court proceeding. So I'm like a third party in the court case, neither the defendant nor the plaintiff. Oops. So, and why was that happening? Because, well, AVM tried to use legal means to restrict the freedoms that the GPL grants to each and every recipient. Right? The GPL is about giving people the freedom to modify the code and to run modified versions of the code. And all the modifications that Sybit made were inside free software code licensed under the GPL or other free and open source licenses. They did not modify any proprietary program of AVM. They modified the GPL licensed Linux kernel. They modified some startup scripts that are not copyrightable anyway because they're too simple. So they did not do any modifications of anything that AVM has copyright on. So the court actually lifted that preliminary injunction and only put a condition in there that there was something was displayed wrong in the web interface of the product after this modification, and AVM basically, not based on copyright but based on unfair competition law, claimed that, well, if the user then has this wrong display web interface, they will call the support and they will blame AVM for something being wrongly displayed in the web interface. So completely unrelated to the fact whether something is modified or not. So after that, this dispute procedure of the preliminary injunction, the modification was permitted again. And then, well, they went into the next instance of the court and into the next instance of the court, until we ended up at the highest court in the state of Berlin. So Berlin is one of the states in the Federal Republic of Germany, so we ended up at the highest court in Berlin, which is just one court below the federal court. So AVM sues Seibitz again in those main proceedings. I'm side intervening again. And AVM is making claims over claims, and they hire I think it's 2 or 3 law firms and tons of paper. It's really, I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that overall all the paperwork in these legal cases is more than 1,000 pages. No problem at all. Yeah, up to a point where I personally doubt that the court has ever read all of these papers. But it's quite funny, and I unfortunately haven't found time yet, but I always wanted to publish a page with quotes from all these documents because it's so ridiculous. So one of the things they said, well, basically, they always said, well, this is the firmware as a whole, you cannot look at it as lots of individual things, it is the firmware. But then if you ask them, well, do you consider the firmware as one work or as one derivative work, then of course they said, no, we never claimed that. And it always circulated around that. Well, the court recognizes that GPL licensed software is used and modified, but then AVM makes some other interesting claims that it is an illegal modification under copyright law because Seibitz is using RM mode. So AVM ships the RM mode command and the kernel with support for unloading modules, and then Seibitz is using RM mode to unload a kernel module. And because the memory content is modified, there is a copyright violation because there's a module being removed from the kernel. Then they make other interesting claims that another illegal copy is happening because one of AVM's proprietary programs, which is in the flash image, is copied from flash into RAM and executed. And this copy from flash into RAM of the proprietary program is completely a violation of copyright, and it needs to be stopped. And lots of other claims, really funny. Another thing is that they claim, well, copyright talks about software, but we are talking about firmware here. So copyright cannot apply to the firmware, of course. It's not software, it's firmware. You know, a very logical attempt. Another thing they claimed in front of court is that, well, this device is not a computer because it does not have keyboard and screen. It's ridiculous. You know? Like, what? Do you see any computer? Talking to the judge. Like, crazy guy. It's a really crazy guy. So the verdict, the final verdict, was, well, that AVM cannot restrict Seibitz based on copyright law due to the provisions in the GPL, of course, which, well, was clear to me, but well, we had to go through all these deliberations. However, interestingly, and that's a big surprise, the court said, well, the firmware constitutes a collective work. So, for whatever reason that is unknown to us, the court thought, no, this is a collective work, and in the court verdict they actually state, black on white, that because it's a collective work, the collective work becomes infected by the GPL. So actually what they're saying is that because there is a collective work and one of the components is the Linux kernel, the entire collective work must be GPL. That's what they say in the court verdict, which is, I never asked for it. Nobody in the court, in that entire court case has ever asked for it, but that is in that verdict. And so to us, it was completely clear that AVM would make another, how can I say, another lawsuit in the federal court, in the highest court, saying that no, you cannot look at it like this. But no, AVM did not. So they accepted that verdict. After years of fighting, they accepted such a strange verdict that is weird. So what does it mean? They actually literally write infect in the verdict. So what does this infection mean? What is the result of that infection? Does it mean that all the individual components of the collective work also have to be released under GPL license, which of course would not be possible? It's a file system image with hundreds of different programs. Some of them are GPL, some of them are other licenses. Why is it not mere aggregation on a storage medium, like the GPL says? I mean, the GPL actually says that mere aggregation on a storage medium with non-GPL software is possible, is permitted. So if you have a CD-ROM and it contains a proprietary flash player and a proprietary Oracle database and the GPL licensed kernel, of course that's mere aggregation. But why is a file system image inside the embedded device not mere aggregation, according to the opinion of that court? They did not explain that at all. It's quite funny. The judgment of the court, I think it's 15 or 17 pages explaining all the facts, right? Explaining how everything is, you know, what kind of components and who has claimed what and what has happened in which order of events. And then there's, I think, 1.5 pages of explanation why they come to this result. So it's really strange verdict. And I personally believe that AVM, in the beginning of the case, always insisting that, well, this is one firmware, you know, it's not all kinds of different components. This is actually, they shot themselves this way, right? Because, in other words, okay, yeah, well, it's a collective work, thank you. So, it may not have been the wisest of strategies. But yes, so now we have a very strange court ruling, which goes far beyond what I think I and many others would expect the GPL to do. But it is a court verdict, and it's in a relatively high court. Okay, so what do we learn from that? Some companies really behave outrageous when it comes to GPL compliance. They fight very hard to restrict the freedom of the GPL, and it actually can come back in a very bad way to them. And by doing all this, AVM, I think, has at least, well, as I said, around here nobody knows them, but in Germany at least they have proven that they're probably the worst aggressor against the freedom of the GPL and have failed to get away with it. Now, beyond the AVM case, what other things are currently happening? Well, at GPL violations.org, we're looking a lot at the moment at Chinese Android phones, because traditionally in Europe you only see HTC, Samsung, LG, Motorola, you know, those kind of brands. And now we start to see phones from TCT Mobile, from ZTE, from Huawei, and from others. And I think so far I have not seen a single one of them that's GPL compliant, which is quite surprising given the fact that, you know, there are other Huawei devices which are GPL compliant and that they've been along for a very long time, and so on and so on. So right now our main attention is looking at all those devices, and actually last week we have obtained a preliminary injunction halting the sale of TCT phones, TCT Android phones in Germany. So that's hasn't been publicized yet, but TCT really knows about that. It's one of the, I never understand how companies can come up with such strategies. So there's TCT Mobile has a European subsidiary, and we have made a legal case against them, and they have never responded once. They've just it's like I don't know, forwarding all the documents to dev null. You know, they're completely silent, never react to anything, and completely ignore everything. And of course, if you completely ignore everything, you cannot even make some statement in your defense or anything like that. It's quite strange. So, well, I wonder how long they can keep that up. And I think this may sound a bit, I don't have any problem with China, but I think the companies that ship products into Western markets, they really need to make sure that they're GPL compliant. I mean, if they serve the domestic market and there is not a good legal system for enforcement there, then okay, they can probably try to get away with it, but as soon as they want to ship into Western markets, that's not going to work. Another thing that I just personally had a lot of interest in is oscilloscopes. So there's some digital storage oscilloscopes from China that are Linux-based, which of course is great, me being somebody who's doing a lot of electrical engineering as well. I like a scope where I can change the software, where I can add some code for triggering onto certain waveforms or something like that. It's actually very cool to have an oscilloscope that runs Linux. But of course it was completely no source code, not GPL compliant and so on. But it has been enforced now. and the company selling, or the manufacturer has released the source code, and not only, you know, not only the original Linux kernel and have binary-only kernel modules. No, they released the source code to all their kernel modules as well, including the drivers for the entire oscilloscope type, oscilloscope part of the device. So now we have a very nice oscilloscope that people can reprogram and can do all kinds of cool things with. And there are already people, there's some wiki pages, even on the eLinux wiki, about these devices, where people have been adding like Wi-Fi or Ethernet to the oscilloscope, which it doesn't have in the original design, and all kinds of additions and modifications that people are doing around these oscilloscopes. What's also funny is that the hardware of all those scopes is exactly identical, but you can buy them as 60 megahertz, 150 megahertz, and 200 megahertz version, and it's really just some software filtering in the FPGA. There's no single hardware difference, so by doing some firmware modification, you can upgrade from 60 to 200 megahertz, which, well, funny business model. Of course, doesn't work with free software. So people can just buy the cheapest scope and upgrade it to the most expensive one. Well, then we have been seeing some more. But I'm not quite sure how I should call them. I call them store-branded OEM devices. So there's a store; it has a certain name, and basically they sell devices under their own brand name. But of course, they have not a single engineer in the entire company. And they just buy these devices from ODMs in China and God knows where. And actually I found one of these where we have found more than 13 currently active products that are completely GPL compliant. So that's, well, drawing a lot of resources to do all the reverse engineering and so on and so on. And I'm very surprised, because there's so much enforcement being done in recent years, that we will find a vendor that has basically almost the entire product portfolio is GPL violated. Another thing that has happened recently is cooperation with the Free Software Foundation Europe, a more active one. So what happens is that the cases on which we have done GPL enforcement, we hand them over, after we are finished, we hand them over to the Free Software Foundation Europe, who have some volunteers who will then check whether there are any, you know, some months later, if there are any firmware updates for the device, if those firmware updates have source code or not, for example, because that's a very common mistake. Is that, well, you do GPL enforcement and then they publish the source code for one firmware version, and then they do a firmware upgrade, and then there's no source code for the upgrade. Of course, all the upgrades need to be GPL compliant. So they are doing that kind of checking because it's, well, it's time consuming. We don't have the resources for it. They have some volunteers that, that are willing to do that. And the nice part about it is, well, if they find incompliance on products where there has been GPL enforcement before, not only can we start the GPL enforcement procedure again, but we also can enforce a contractual penalty at that point. So there's actually infringing on the same product a second time becomes even more difficult or more expensive for a company. So every time they infringe again, it becomes more expensive for them. And that contractual penalty then goes as a donation to Free Software Foundation Europe, which can use it for many useful things to support free software development and free software related causes. Okay, well, that was my presentation. I hope it was interesting. Thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions, we still have some 10 minutes or so to discuss them. Thanks. Yeah, well, it's Florence.
Yeah, Howard, you talked about that Secretary Freedom Conservancy mispresent, and then why is this mispresentation come from, and what's the right one? Why that happened?
I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I mean, I have spoken several times with Bradley. I don't really see that much of a reason for concern. One cause for this misconception or misunderstanding that I can think of is the documents that have been, there was one, was it Best Buy? There was one case that they did in the US where, of course, lots of documents normally in US legal cases become part of the public record. And I think Best Buy's lawyer has claimed has basically claimed that the Conservancy mandates future source code audits in order to reinstate the rights and those kind of things. And Bradley insists that this is just some lawyer trying to make a wrong statement at court, which lawyers do all the time if they want to defend their clients. So. The Conservancy has stated several times that they do not require any future source code audits to reinstate the rights under the GDPR. They offer that as an option, or they recommend that maybe, but it is not a requirement for reinstatement of your rights under GDPR of the enforcement done by the Conservancy. And it has never been, and they have never made it a requirement. I have very explicit statements on that regard from the Conservancy. So, you know, that's if you look at if I just think of my own experience in the AVM case, the kind of statements that their lawyers made in court, of course, they're completely bogus. They're just trying to argue their case. And if you think, if people think whatever the Best Buy lawyer has claimed in that document is outright true, then of course it cannot be. It may not be correct what they claim. Well, some other things that people still remember from the SFLC-based enforcement. So sometimes I think there's some misconception about some bad experience that people may have made under SFLC enforcement, and then they now think it's the same with the Conservancy. But I think the policy and how they handle cases is quite a bit different. So I think it is not it's not correct to extrapolate from SFLC strategy to Conservancy strategy. So. Shane.
Harold, have you seen a slight improvement in markets after 1 or 2 years of adoption? For example, in mobile, do you think it got better after a couple of years, or does it take a long run of 5 or 6 years before you see improvement?
It's difficult. It's very difficult. There are some. In the mobile sphere, for example, I think there are some companies like Motorola, like Samsung, that have a very, very good track record by now, who have realized at some point in the past they have a problem. Motorola was one of the earliest cases I did, actually. I think it must have been 2004, 2005, around that time, but long before Android. But they already had Linux-based phones. So, so they have, I think it depends on the respective organizations whether they actually change something about their procedures and about the way how they, the processes inside the business, the way how they do product development to ensure that the GDPR compliance is something they look at. There are other companies where I have not seen such a change. If you look at HTC, for example, it's you know, it's very obvious that they actively try to go all, how can I say, to go always to the absolute maximum bleeding edge of something that will just not get them sued, but still upset almost everyone in the entire community. Well, the funny thing is, I can speak about this, about HTC for a second. It's You know, I think everyone here knows their story about the 90-day delay. That, oh, because the GPL doesn't say when we have to publish the source, we just assume it will be 90 days, and sometimes they even said 120 days. I wonder when they will say 3,000 days at some point maybe, or, you know. But the funny thing is, when I ask for the source code, it doesn't take 2 weeks and it appears on the website. So I think it depends on who is asking for the source code, how long they actually take to release it. So, because I was actually, you know, I was prepared to actually file a lawsuit, but then within less than 2 weeks the source code appeared. So I think all that needs to happen is that somebody needs to tell me whenever there's a source code missing, and then I'm sending them a nice email, and it will be released much more quickly than if somebody had asked them directly. So I think we'll have to go that route until I don't know what will happen. But HTC is really, you can see and feel and hear at every move that they do not want to work with free software. It's very sad. And that's very, very different from other companies. Like Samsung, for example, if you look at the early Samsung source code releases of Android phones, they still had proprietary kernel modules. If you look at the more modern ones, gone, sometimes maybe still one or so, but they're actually trying to not only get out of the black and white kind of GPL compliance, no source code, no written offer, but they're also trying to get out of the gray area of binary only kernel modules. So it's a different policy. And then there are other companies that, what I want to get to is that the amount of fluctuation of employees they have is so high that every 2 or 3 years, basically everyone who knew and understood GPL compliance has left the company again. And then they run into this again. And this is not just, so now people may think, oh yes, this sounds a bit like Taiwan. Yes, there are Taiwanese companies where I see this happening, but I also see this with some European companies. So it's not I cannot say it's a specific problem here or something like that. But it's often I feel it depends on one or a couple of people who really know how to handle this, and as soon as they are gone, you know, the legacy of their doing is also gone, and they run into problems again.
So
but
it's a social issue almost.
Yeah.
Anything else.
Yeah, I mean, so I think as long as we were dealing primarily with Wi-Fi routers, DSL routers, and so on, it could be seen that there is such I don't think we see many Wi-Fi routers or DSL routers being GPL compliant anymore. So I think, yes, there we can see it, but in all the other markets, no. I haven't really seen a significant trend towards more compliance. I think what has happened though is that some companies like Buffalo, they try to be, Japanese company, isn't it? They try to be particularly smart. And in every product in their manual, they have a page, this product may contain traces of nuts. No, it says this product may contain GPL licensed software. But that, of course, is not sufficient. You know, it's not a. You have to say which software is licensed under which license. It's also something that many companies do wrong. I mean, you cannot just say, well, there's some GPL licensed software and there's some other software. How is the user supposed to know which license applies to what? I mean, you have to say, this is that software and this is licensed under a certain license. Otherwise, it's bogus. Especially with HTC, that's, by the way, another problem. If you look at the HTC legal text in the Android phones, like the HTC One X I looked recently, it's they have 3 or 4 different licensed texts, and none of them clearly indicates about which software they actually speak. So, yeah. Okay. Questions? Well, I think we're running out of time. No? One more question. Okay, well, thanks.
好，谢谢，我们谢谢那个。